"If I sing well, will you give me a plate of food?" said a black homeless girl at a talent show. The lights burned bright above her, almost too harsh for her tired eyes. Amira Lane stood in the middle of the massive Voices of America stage, her small frame swallowed by the spotlight. The crowd whispered, some chuckled, and others pointed at the torn dress that barely fit her and the dusty shoes that had carried her across miles of city streets. She gripped her cracked guitar tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear enough to pierce through the noise. "If I sing well," she asked softly, "will you give me a plate of food?" For a heartbeat, the entire room went silent. The laughter faded. You could almost hear people breathing, shocked, confused, uncomfortable. Then, from the judge's table, Eric Dalton leaned back in his chair, smirking. His voice dripped with arrogance as he said, "This is not a charity, sweetheart. If you wanted dinner, you came to the wrong stage." The audience laughed again, cruelly this time, and Amira lowered her eyes. But instead of walking away, she stepped closer to the microphone, her fingers brushing the strings of her battered guitar. Her heart pounded, yet her expression was calm, determined. She took one deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. Before we hear what happens next, make sure you are subscribed, because stories like this remind us why every voice deserves to be heard. Hit the like button and let's keep going. Atlanta was not kind to the forgotten. Beneath the glossy skyline and luxury condos, there were corners of the city where people disappeared into shadows. And that's where Amira Lane had learned to survive. Most nights, she slept near the subway tunnels, curled beneath a tattered blanket someone had left behind. The rumble of trains above her was like a heartbeat, steady, unfeeling, and far away. When the city grew quiet, she would hum softly, her voice echoing off cold walls, carrying a melody that reminded her she was still alive. In the mornings, she'd walk the busy streets barefoot, singing near coffee shops and bus stops, hoping a kind stranger would drop a coin or two. Most passed without looking. Some laughed. Others filmed her on their phones, amused by the homeless girl with the golden voice. But Amira did not sing for them. She sang for herself, and for the woman she barely remembered, Celeste Lane, her grandmother. A gospel singer whose voice once filled small-town churches with light. All Amira had of her was a small, weathered notebook filled with old gospel lyrics. She carried it everywhere, pressed close to her chest like a heartbeat of hope. The pages were wrinkled and smudged with dirt and rain, but when she opened them, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "The world will not always clap for you, baby. Sometimes you'll have to clap for yourself." Those words kept her alive. At night, when the rain fell hard, she'd whisper to herself, "It's just applause from heaven." She'd close her eyes, pretend she was on a stage, lights shining down, an audience rising to their feet. In her imagination, she was not a girl from the tunnels. She was a star. Still, hunger was real. Hope could not fill an empty stomach. Some days she'd go 2-3 nights without eating. She learned which restaurants threw out food at closing time and waited patiently near the dumpsters. Once, she found a half-eaten sandwich and whispered, "Thank you," before taking a bite, gratitude in place of shame. But even the strongest faith can flicker. There were moments when Amira questioned if her grandmother's notebook was just a collection of broken dreams. She saw others around her, people who had given up long ago, men who drank to forget, women who sold what little they had left. And in those moments, a small voice inside whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe music can't feed you." Yet every time she thought about quitting, something small and beautiful pulled her back. A child smiling as she sang, a stranger tossing her $1 with a quiet, "You've got something special," or the sound of her own voice harmonizing with the hum of passing trains. Then one afternoon changed everything. Amira was sitting near a street mural, a faded painting of angels over the skyline. When a gust of wind knocked a poster against her leg, she picked it up. The words were bold and bright. "Voices of America, National Talent Search. Winner gets 100,000 and a recording contract." For a moment, she just stared at it. Her reflection shimmered faintly in a puddle beside the paper. The face of a girl who had nothing but a song. She laughed softly. "That's not for people like me," she said to no one. But her eyes lingered on the small print. "Open to all ages, all voices, all stories. Maybe, just maybe." That night, she could not sleep. She kept imagining what it would feel like to stand on a real stage. To sing not for coins, but for a chance. By morning, her decision was made. She tore the poster down and held it close, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and faith. The venue was miles away. She had no bus fare, no shoes, and barely any energy. But Amira Lane had something else. A stubborn spark that refused to die. She began to walk. The pavement burned her feet. Cars sped past, splashing dirty water on her clothes. Still, she kept going. Each step was a prayer, each breath a promise. Just one chance, Lord, just one. By the time she reached the audition hall, her voice was hoarse, her hair damp from sweat and rain. Dozens of people stood in line, dressed in heels, makeup, and perfect smiles. Amira looked down at herself. Torn jeans, worn t-shirt, muddy feet, and felt her courage falter. Then she touched her grandmother's notebook. Celeste Lane's lyrics whispered back to her through memory. Even the smallest light can break the darkest night. When the door finally opened, a voice called out from inside the hall. Steady, professional, and unaware that history was about to shift. Next up, Amira Lane. She took a deep breath, stepped forward, and whispered, "Grandma, this one's for you." The hall was brighter than any place Amira had ever seen. Rows of lights glared down from the ceiling, blinding her as she stepped onto the stage. Her bare feet pressed against the polished floor, cold and unfamiliar. She blinked, trying to adjust. The audience, hundreds of faces, stared back, whispering, some laughing already. Their clothes sparkled, their cameras gleamed. She felt small, invisible. At the judges' table, Eric Dalton leaned back in his chair, adjusting his designer jacket. He gave a knowing smirk to the other judges beside him, the kind that said, "Let's get this over with." "Name?" Eric asked into the mic, not bothering to hide his boredom. "Amira Lane," she said softly, clutching her old guitar. Eric arched an eyebrow. "And what will you be performing for us today, Amira?" She hesitated. "A song I wrote, and maybe something my grandmother used to sing." The audience chuckled. One judge whispered something that made the others laugh. The sound echoed through the hall, heavy and cruel. Amira swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she lifted her cracked guitar, the same one she'd found in a thrift store dumpster months ago. The strings were uneven, the sound rough, but it was all she had. She began to strum. The notes came out thin and shaky. Someone in the audience shouted, "Turn it up, we can't hear her!" Behind her, a stagehand glanced toward Eric. Eric gave a slow nod, and the stagehand reached for the cable. A soft click, then silence. Her microphone went dead. The audience erupted in laughter. Phones came out. Someone shouted, "Guess her song's over already!" Amira froze. Her throat tightened. For a second, she thought about walking off the stage, disappearing back into the streets where no one could see her fall. But then, she remembered her grandmother's voice. "The world will not always clap for you, baby. Sometimes you'll have to clap for yourself." She closed her eyes. Slowly, she set the broken guitar aside. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady when she began to sing. At first, it was barely above a whisper. "Amazing grace." How sweet the sound. The crowd quieted. Her tone was raw, pure, every note carrying a lifetime of hunger, pain, and hope. She sang without a mic, without music, without fear. That saved a wretch like me. A hush spread across the hall. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Her voice rose, filling every corner of the room. The melody trembled but did not break. You could feel her story in every word. The nights in the tunnel, the rain, the hunger, the fire that refused to die. Eric's smirk faded. He sat forward, hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on her. The judges stopped whispering. The audience, moments ago laughing, now stared in stunned silence. When she reached the final line, her voice cracked. But that crack carried truth, beauty, something real. Was blind, but now I see. Her last note lingered in the air like smoke, trembling, fading, unforgettable. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the cameramen froze. Then slowly someone in the back stood up and began to clap. Another followed, then another, until the sound grew. Applause rolling through the hall like thunder. Amira stood still, tears glistening in her eyes, not sure if this was real. Eric Dalton leaned toward his mic. For the first time that night, his voice was quiet. "Thank you, Amira Lane," he said. That was something else. The lights dimmed as she stepped off stage, her breath shaking. She did not win anything yet. No money, no contract. But something inside her had changed. For the first time in her life, the world had listened. And the echo of her song refused to fade. Backstage, chaos erupted the moment Amira walked off the stage. Producers huddled around Eric Dalton, their voices sharp and heated. One of the judges threw off her headset, saying, "You can't just call that a sympathy act, Eric." The crowd loved her. Eric slammed his coffee cup down on the table. Loved her? She came in here barefoot, begging for food. It is a circus act, not talent. His tone was bitter, his pride bruised. From the stage, a low chant began to rise. Faint at first, then louder. "Amira! Amira!" "Amira!" The audience refused to calm down. They were standing, clapping, calling her name as if she had already won. Eric's jaw tightened. "Get them back in their seats," he barked to an assistant. "We are not turning this show into a charity parade." But in the control booth above the stage, Grace Holloway watched the screen without blinking. The glow of the monitors lit her face as Amira's performance replayed on multiple feeds. Each time she heard that trembling note of Amazing Grace, something deep in her stirred. She leaned closer, muttering softly, "I've heard that tone before." A memory surfaced. An old vinyl record spinning in her childhood living room. The cover showed a woman with the same soft eyes, the same unshakable grace. Celeste Lane, a gospel legend who once performed at the National Cathedral in 1963. Grace's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. She searched the archives. When the image loaded, she froze. Amira looked almost exactly like her. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Amira sat alone on a wooden bench. Her cracked guitar rested beside her, her hands still shaking. She could still hear the crowd chanting her name. For the first time in years, that sound made her feel seen. A young production assistant ran up to her, breathless. "You need to come back! You're trending!" "Trending?" Amira blinked, confused. "People are posting your song everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, you already have millions of views." Downstairs, Eric paced the green room, watching his phone blow up with notifications. He had wanted drama, but not this. Compassion was not the kind of attention he liked. It made him look like the villain. "She is stealing my show," he muttered. "We are supposed to be finding stars, not sob stories." Grace walked in just then, holding a worn black and white photo in her hand. "You might want to sit down, Eric." He rolled his eyes. "Not now, Grace. I'm trying to manage a viral disaster." "This disaster," she said, laying the photo in front of him, "just might save your job." He looked down. The picture showed a woman standing in front of a church choir, microphone in hand. Celeste Lane. The resemblance to Amira was undeniable, Grace continued, her voice steady but firm. "Amira Lane is Celeste Lane's granddaughter." Eric blinked. "What are you talking about? She carries the same middle name, the same tone, even the same phrasing. I just confirmed it with the music archive." Grace's eyes gleamed. "Do you realize what this means? We are standing in front of musical history, and you almost silenced her." Before Eric could respond, Grace turned and walked toward the stage. The crowd was still buzzing, the next act frozen backstage, unsure what to do. Grace grabbed a spare microphone and stepped into the spotlight. The audience gasped as she appeared, the executive director interrupting the live show. She raised her hand for silence and said into the mic, "Ladies and gentlemen, something extraordinary just happened tonight." All eyes were on her. Eric stood frozen behind the curtain. Grace glanced toward Amira, who stood at the edge of the stage, unsure if she should come forward. "This young woman," Grace said slowly, "may not know it herself, but her voice carries a legacy America forgot." The audience leaned in. The tension was electric. Eric could only watch as the story he had tried to bury began to rise. Stronger, louder, unstoppable. The hall fell into absolute silence. Every eye turned toward Grace Holloway as she stepped forward beneath the bright stage lights, holding a worn black and white photograph. Its corners were torn, the image faded by time, but the story it carried was alive. That picture showed Celeste Lane, one of the first black women to graduate from Juilliard in the 1960s. A woman who had once stood before microphones that went dead and crowds that turned away. A woman who kept singing anyway. And tonight, her legacy stood just a few feet away, trembling, barefoot, and unaware of the name she carried. Gasps rippled through the audience as Grace's words echoed across the room. People leaned forward, whispering in disbelief. The resemblance was undeniable. The same calm eyes, the same quiet strength, the same soul that refused to be silenced. Celeste Lane had once faced a world that mocked her faith and color. Decades later, her granddaughter stood in that same light, facing the same cruelty, from an industry that still had not learned. Eric Dalton's smug expression disappeared. The color drained from his face as Grace exposed the truth before millions of viewers. Behind him, the giant screen lit up with backstage footage, his own voice filling the hall. "She came here barefoot, begging for food. This is not a charity. It's a show." The audience gasped again, their shock turning to outrage. The laughter that once mocked Amira now rose against Eric. Boos echoed through the studio. Viewers across the country shared the clip online, and within minutes, it was everywhere. Grace's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. She reminded everyone of what they had just witnessed. The arrogance, the cruelty, the attempt to humiliate a girl who had done nothing but sing. He tried to defend himself, stumbling over his words, but it was too late. His reputation was collapsing live on air, every second broadcasted to millions. The control room received updates faster than they could process them. Sponsors pulling out, networks calling in. Then Grace made the final move that sealed his fate. Her voice carried through every speaker in the studio and every television in the nation. For everyone watching at home, the network has just informed me that we are cutting all ties with Eric Dalton, effective immediately. The crowd exploded. Applause thundered through the building. People rose to their feet, chanting Amira's name. Eric stood frozen in place. His empire had fallen in less than 10 minutes. Security approached, and the man who once ruled with arrogance was escorted quietly off the stage. Defeated, humiliated, forgotten. And through the cheers, Amira remained still. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at her worn hands, realizing the weight they carried. She had sung for food, and ended up feeding the world something far greater: truth. Grace stepped closer, her voice gentle yet full of pride. She reminded Amira that the spirit she carried was the same that once moved generations. The voice she had found on the streets of Atlanta was the same voice that had once filled churches and concert halls across America. For a moment, the noise faded, replaced by the heartbeat of a miracle. Amira pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a silent thank you to the woman she never met, and to the strength that refused to die with her. The crowd chanted her name again, louder this time, until it drowned every other sound. Amira. 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 Under the same lights that once exposed her poverty, she now stood tall. No longer a hungry street girl, but the living echo of a legacy reborn. Days later, the world could not stop talking about her. Clips of Amira's trembling performance spread across every screen, from tiny phones to massive billboards. Within a week, the homeless girl who silenced America became the headline everywhere. News anchors replayed her voice on morning shows. Talk hosts called her a miracle wrapped in pain. Even people who once walked past her on the street now claimed they had always believed in her. But behind the noise, one woman was working quietly: Grace Holloway. She did not want this story to fade away like every other viral moment. So, she launched the Celeste Lane Foundation, named after Amira's grandmother. Its purpose was simple but powerful: to help young musicians from the streets find a stage of their own. And the first person she chose to support was Amira. Grace and her husband opened their home to her. For the first time in years, Amira had her own bed, her own room, and a door she could close at night. There were no cold floors or restless city sounds, only warmth, music, and care. Every morning, she trained with vocal coaches, her voice growing stronger and more confident. She learned how to control her breathing, how to pour emotion into every note. At night, she would sit by the window, writing lyrics about hope, forgiveness, and second chances. The same girl who once sang for Loose Change was now recording her first single in a real studio. Each word carried her journey: the hunger, the heartbreak, and the quiet faith that had kept her alive. 6 months later, the impossible happened. Amira stood on the grand stage of Carnegie Hall. The golden lights reflected off her white gown as thousands waited in silence. Grace watched proudly from the front row, tears glistening in her eyes. As the orchestra began, Amira closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Then her voice filled the hall. Clear, powerful, and full of truth. Every note seemed to rise higher, as if Celeste Lane herself was singing through her. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet. Flashbulbs flashed like stars, applause thundered through the hall. Even the toughest critics wiped their eyes. That night, Amira's concert raised $5 million for the Celeste Lane Foundation. Money that would now help other forgotten voices find their place in the world. As she stood under the spotlight, Amira smiled, not with pride but peace. She had walked through pain, through hunger, through shame, and turned it all into something beautiful. Her story was no longer just about survival. It was about transformation, about finding light after the longest night. And when Grace whispered, "Your grandmother would be proud," Amira looked up at the ceiling of Carnegie Hall and softly said, "She already is." A year later, Amira stood on the grand stage of the Grammys, a golden award shining in her trembling hands. The crowd roared her name, but all she could think about was how far she had come. From cold nights on the sidewalk to this moment under blinding lights. Her voice quivered as she spoke. She thanked her late grandmother, Celeste Lane, for the voice that lived on through her. She thanked Grace Holloway for seeing light where others saw nothing. And then, she smiled softly and said, "To everyone who once doubted me, thank you. You were the rhythm behind my rise." The audience rose to their feet, clapping as tears filled her eyes. But Amira did not cry out of pride. She cried because she finally felt free. After the ceremony, backstage was filled with flashing lights and hurried footsteps. Her new assistant handed her a small white envelope. "Someone asked me to make sure you got this," he said quietly. Amira turned it over and froze. The name written on the back stopped her breath for a moment. Lauren Scott. She remembered that name. The girl who had laughed the loudest when her microphone was unplugged. The one who whispered "charity case" as Amira stood broken on that stage months ago. With steady fingers, Amira opened the letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "You sang for food, but you fed my soul. I mocked what I did not understand. Thank you for showing me what real strength sounds like." Amira read it twice, her eyes glistening. Then, instead of anger, she smiled. A soft, forgiving smile that carried peace. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag beside an old photograph of her grandmother. Later that evening, she returned to the Foundation's hall, where a new display had been set up. A tribute to Celeste Lane and Amira's journey. In the center stood her old, cracked guitar, the same one that once failed her on stage, now resting proudly behind glass. Beneath it, engraved in gold, were the words, "For every voice that refused to stay silent." Amira stood there for a long moment, her reflection glimmering on the glass. She touched her pendant, her grandmother's pendant, and whispered, "We did it." Outside, the city lights flickered like a melody. Somewhere, another street singer strummed a guitar, unaware that her own story was about to begin. From hunger to harmony, that was Amira Lane's song, a song that reminded the world that dreams do not ask where you come from. They only ask how loud you are willing to sing.